Conservation and Corridors: The Yellowstone to Yukon Initiative by Ashley Brundrett and Lauren Tilstra. Ecosystems rely on many parts to function. When the conditions are not right, the species must migrate to new habitat or they will die. The concept of island biogeography relates area to species population size. The population survives when the births and the immigration rate is greater than the deaths and the emigration rate. The larger an island is, the more resilient it is. Also, the closer an island of habitat is to other islands, the easier it is for species to migrate from one island to the next, increasing island resilience as well. Resilience and biodiversity are important for many reasons. First, more biodiversity helps more species to survive. Each species affects the others in some way, so when one species goes extinct, it has repercussions throughout the entire ecosystem. Also, biodiversity helps humans by offering a large variety of resources to be used for important products like medicines. The concept of island biogeography can be applied to terrestrial habitats, where the islands of habitat are surrounded by developed land rather than water. The problem with islands is that some species get trapped and are unable to migrate to new habitat when resources run out. In order to maintain the most biodiversity possible in each island of habitat, areas must be connected, so species living there can experience a range of different ecosystems and resources, and so they can have lots of room to grow. As the effects of climate change get worse, protecting biodiversity will become more and more important. Because of the changing environment, many species will go extinct and have already. In order to protect species and preserve biodiversity, large, resilient islands of habitat must be created and connected in the United States and across the rest of the world. This is why corridors are so important in conservation. Corridors are strips of natural habitat that connect larger habitats, allowing for species migration. Connectivity of habitats is important for species survival because it allows species to move freely to avoid competition or depletion of resources. The extinction crisis is happening right now. Species are dying out at a much faster rate than in the past, and it is mainly due to human activity. Conservation of natural habitats is more important now than ever. During the late 80s and the early 90s, several scientists, conservationists, and others began to discuss how islands of habitat could be connected in the Rocky Mountains. Some supported connecting smaller regions, like Glacier National Park in northern Montana to Banff National Park in British Columbia. However, nothing happened. No one was quite sure of how to connect these areas until the summer of 1993, when Harvey Locke, the founder of Y2Y, spent over 2 weeks traveling through the Rocky Mountains. In his time there, he realized that the area connecting Yellowstone to the Yukon Territory is simply one gigantic linear ecosystem. By connecting these two major islands of habitat, thousands of species could expand their territories and resources. This inspired him to think bigger than any other scientist had and connect Yellowstone to Yukon. In December 1993, scientists, environmentalists, politicians, biologists, and many others met in Alberta, Canada. There, Yellowstone to Yukon changed from an idea to a concrete plan. From there, these different groups worked together to form a huge network of supporters from all different walks of life. The group learned to work with business executives, marketing specialists, politicians, and other people who could possibly have a significant impact on the Rocky Mountains ecosystem. The Yellowstone to Yukon initiative was envisioned to create a 2,000-mile stretch of protected natural lands in order to conserve the biodiversity and the natural beauty of the land on a much larger scale than ever before. Waidawai consists of protected lands and other lands designated for conservation that they are working on protecting with conservation easements or land purchase. The goal of Waidawai will allow uninterrupted natural habitat for species movement from the United States all the way to northern Canada. Locke wrote that we need to think beyond parks as islands to whole landscapes. Research shows that animal populations need to be connected at vast scales in order to remain viable. In the 24 years since its creation, Waidawai has made a huge impact on the ecosystem. Between 1993 and 2013, the amount of protected land between Yellowstone and Yukon has doubled, and the amount of other designated lands increased to 30 times its original size. As a whole, the amount of land increased from 12% to 52%. This program has created 2 national parks, which together cover a land area 4 times the size of Yellowstone. In the Flathead River Valley, regulations were passed to protect 161,874 hectares of land from being used for oil or gas development. Over 90 million people have been exposed to media explaining the Yellowstone to Yukon initiative. Waidawai has also contributed to the creation of new policies to protect wilderness, making transportation more wildlife friendly, restoring the natural habitats in the ecosystem, and promoting development that allows both humans and animals to flourish. The true test of the program's success, however, is the activity of animals in this ecosystem. In 1993, when the program started, grizzly bear populations lived in separate areas in the United States and Canada. Certain areas in the Rocky Mountains had not seen a grizzly bear for decades. After tracking grizzly patterns for the last 24 years, conservationists have seen this gap close. Northern grizzly bears have come as far south as the Montana-Wyoming border, and southern grizzlies have migrated farther north to habitats that the species had been separated from. Overall, the Yellowstone to Yukon initiative has been largely successful. However, the work is not done. There are still millions of acres of land to be protected, and species that need to return to habitats they have left behind due to human development. For this poster, we wanted to see how Yellowstone to Yukon could be continued farther south into the United States. To do so, we examined the current Yellowstone to Yukon boundaries around the Wyoming-Idaho border. Then, we picked a few of the largest federal lands in the area to the south of Yellowstone. The northernmost lands that we studied lie just south of Yellowstone, while the southernmost lands are close to the Utah-Colorado-Wyoming border. Using GIS and Linkage Mapper, we measured the friction of distance between each island of habitat. This allowed us to see which areas are easiest to connect based on where wilderness is most prevalent. The darker red areas show which areas can be considered corridors that connect islands of habitat. On the large center map, you can see how the program connected each sample island of habitat in blue to the others using least cost paths in yellow. It is easy to tell where the cities are in this area. The corridors clearly go around any developed areas, like in the large gap between corridors just north of the Utah-Wyoming border, near Rock Springs, Wyoming. After mapping the wilderness, protected lands, and friction of distance on these areas, we can clearly see several corridors where the Yellowstone to Yukon initiative could be continued further south into the United States. Yellowstone can be connected to many other large federal lands, including a 100-mile stretch of mountains in northern Utah between the Ashley National Forest and the city of Kamas, Utah. These areas are very important in conservation, and they will become increasingly important as the climate of the Earth continues to warm. Species will need to adapt to changing environments, and the more area that is open for their habitation, the better. In conclusion, it is obvious that while the Yellowstone to Yukon initiative has made a huge impact on the Rocky Mountain ecosystem, the project is far from over. There are still millions of acres to be set aside in order for the islands of habitat to truly be connected with one another. Also, there are still millions of acres to the south of the Yellowstone to the Yukon area that remain unprotected. These areas need to be included in further conservation plans if we truly want to protect the most species possible. The Yellowstone to Yukon initiative has revolutionized the way that we can look at island biogeography. Instead of trying to protect smaller habitats, conservationists now know that it is possible to connect large ecosystems. In the future, island biogeography will be used on a large scale across the world. Scientists could connect rainforests in South America or swamps in Africa. Because of Yellowstone to Yukon's impact, conservation will never be the same.